my presumption, given having followed China actually closely for 30 years, 20 of which as a BRIC, I'm assuming the authorities think that they can handle the Evergrande fallout. And the idea that started to worry markets early this week that this is going to be a complete systematic collapse of everything related to the Chinese housing sector. I put it like this. I think the Chinese authorities, if need be, would fight that big time, because one thing I have learned over the past 20 years is they're pretty good at managing systematic crises. And so the idea that they'd bring along a self-inflicted one, I kind of don't get it. I remember debating on your show with people like Jim Cramer way back, all these times where people feared a systematic Chinese housing property collapse. And I think they've got a lot of tools to manage it, although I personally wouldn't want to be owning necessarily Evergrande debt. Certainly not equity.
Yeah, well, the equity's down, what, 80 or 90% now. We're showing it in just the last couple of years, Jim. You know, I tweeted out the other day that it feels like China is undergoing sort of the greatest political and societal shift since the 70s, with some of the plans that they've got, Hong Kong, Taiwan, inserting direct control and often government officials into private or public corporations. What do you think President Xi's ultimate strategy is right now?
So on that aspect of your question, this specifically, I have to say I find my mind a bit more fluid, let's say, and not confused, but certainly fluid about quite what they're up to than virtually any time in the past. One of the other great things about them, especially compared to the other BRICS, is that if you follow it closely, it's pretty predictable, in my view, what they would have done. But they're doing a lot of all these things you've just said, but also at a time where their own demographics have turned now, as many expected, me included, to the worse. So the sort of underlying factors that allow them to grow are turning against them marginally anyhow. So to have a lot of additional complications, and you didn't mention the whole battle with Washington on top of it, means that there's a lot of risks. So to keep going down these other ways of essentially scaring the private sector, both domestically and overseas, strikes me to be surprisingly risky. And I can only think it relates to some belief they have that they need to be serious about making Chinese wealth increase be a bit more equal. And they must perceive some real threat to a persistence of this very uneven wealth distribution that has happened in aspects of the past 20 years. But because otherwise it wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, and if our viewers haven't been to China, I mean, you think wealth disparity is here, and in Europe, it's you'll have a $10 million apartment skyrise with a Ferrari dealership in the basement next to a three-story house with 500 people sharing rooms. It's really jarring at some point. But Jim, you know, what power do we have over China? Here's the reality. They are the manufacturer for the world. We're looking at all these supply chain issues right now. What are we going to do? They control literally the means of production.
You know, it's a really fundamental question, and I wish people close to President Biden and our own Prime Minister and others in the West would think more open-mindedly about it, because the answer is we can only help China do what it intends to broadly do better. And this sort of what I think is exceptionally naive presumption that they are rushing to be a democracy like us, you know, has now had many decades of experience. It's just not what Chinese people want, never mind the Communist Party. And so we've got to get away from that. And with it sort of taking for granted that they must do everything just like us, because they don't want to. And if you look at the sort of vague survey evidence or broad contentment surveys about the Han Chinese, most of them are pretty contented people, because notwithstanding the equality issue, hundreds of millions of them have been taken out of poverty. And so, given how they are now so important for the world, and with it, as I've said on your and other shows repeatedly, a massive economic opportunity, we've got to try to help them somehow do it right. Because if they do it wrong and it all falls apart eventually, it will be a disaster for the world economy, a disaster.